Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? I have a pleasure to moderate our next panel. I'm Nelly Bekus from the University of Exeter. And we have three very exciting papers from Dr. Zhyhal, from Dr. Jerzy Rohoziński, and Ivan Zhyhal. Two papers, two presenters are in person and one online. So I guess, so we'll start with the paper by Dr. Zhyhal, Trajectories of Enslavement of the Atlantic Periphery, Tracing an African Woman in 18th-Century Belarusian Lands. Do we have a presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so give us a second to share the presentation, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for introduction. Thank you for help in setting all the stage. So we are used to assuming that history of Belarus is in a racial sense exclusively white. It seems self-evident that it's really unusual even to think and question this assumption. At the same time, if we look more closely at historical sources and scholarship, we find mentions of Africans in Belarusian or generally Polish-Lithuanian history. These references are usually brief, fragmented, and scattered. They are difficult to connect, and they tend to remain outside of any coherent historical narratives. When historians encounter them, they are often treated as exotic curiosities, or sometimes even dismissed as errors or misunderstandings. And yet, the presence of Africans in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and in the Belarusian lands in particular, was not accidental. By the early modern period, the region had become a peripheral, but still integral part of wider proto-globalizing world linked to the Atlantic economy. Within the transimperial networks, not only goods circulated between continents and not only people from our lands traveled overseas, but Africans also arrived here in different ways. Sources show that there were people of African descent that came voluntarily, and even those mixed race Belarusians, Lithuanians, Poles born here. But in early modern context, probably majority were brought without their choice. Often as children abducted from their families and trafficked to Europe, not for labor, but as a kind of living Baroque decorations. So today I would like to try to reconstruct one of these forgotten lives and to explore why we miss these lives and if we can reconstruct them and what we can learn, as long as it's possible in this very brief presentation. So I would like to tell a story about Katarzyna or Katerina, or we don't know her original name. First time she appeared in the sources in the diary of Michael Kazimierz Radziwiłł Rybenko. On the 8th of December 1745, he noted in his diary that a Kalmyk woman, Maura, and Katarzyna Murzynka, the Mooress, converted this day from the Orthodox faith to Catholicism. in this brief entry, he also mentioned that she had originally belonged to the household of Grand Duchess Anna of Muscovy from the German House of Mecklenburg. Complicated story of the time of Russian coup d'etats. So after one of these coup d'etats, this German Russian Kurd party was exiled, and these two women belonging to them were sent to Germany, but somehow on their way they stopped near Swedish and remained there in service of the wife of Rybenka, of famous poetess and dramatist Františka Uršulė Radziwiłł. But how did this African girl arrive in Russia in the first place? My research on the Africans in our region shows that her most likely origin would be West Africa, main source of these slaves. From there, she might be trafficked via European networks. That was the route of many Africans that ended up in Belarus, also in Russia. But here it is another opportunity possible. At this time, Russia maintained diplomatic relations with Persia. And around this time, there were a number of embassies that brought enslaved Africans, among other gifts. Thus, in 1736, for example, alongside the jewels, silks, and elephants, 9 Moors and Mooresses were presented to Russian monarchs, exactly to this Anna and party. In 1741, just a month before this coup d'etat, it was another embassy, but there are no mention of Africans there, but it's still plausible. So probably Katarina can come with one of these embassies as well, not only through Atlantic Way. We cannot be certain about eastern route, but possibly from East Africa through Iran remains also plausible. We do not know her original name and if the girl was originally Muslim or of traditional beliefs. However, consequently, she underwent several conversions and identity rewritings. So what happened next after this baptism, we don't know for a long time. And next mention of her comes from 1773. So on this map you can see Nesvish, where she was baptized and probably lived. But then she moved a bit to the west, to Bielitsa. So the next mention of her comes from 1773, from the travel diary of Teofila Constantia Moravska, born Radziwiłł, the daughter of Radziwiłł Rybenko. Teofila was a pretty unconventional woman. She had married against all expectations to a modest junior officer, despite all the objections of her family, Ignacy Moravski, and lived a rather modest life in Bielitsa manor near Lida, maintaining nevertheless close ties with her powerful family. So in 1773-74, she traveled abroad to visit her exiled brother Karol Stanisław Radziwiłł Panik-Kochanku and other relatives, and during this European journey, she briefly noted that she was accompanied with some small staff, including Katarzyna Murzynka, the Moorish, and Wojciech. You see this underlined in original and in edition. Probably Katarzyna kept service with the daughter of her former masters in this manner. And if you pay attention at the slide, you see that this short diary remark itself has a pretty revealing stream. The contemporary editor of the diary publication did not believe his eyes that Katarzyna could be a Murzynka, a Moorish, African. Why African in Bielitsa near Lida? So he chose to correct spelling, despite it is in handwriting very clearly, and he offered that it is some plausible Polish surname Muszynka. This is a case of unintended retrospective erasure, very common for many Africans in our sources, even those Africans participating in the manufacturing of Slutsk sashes. All of the time were read like not Murzynkas, but Murzyczka, like peasant women. So it's not an intentional act, but just this retrospective erasure that contributed to this silencing this invisible marginalized group. And also pay attention to Wojciech. Wojciech, mentioned alongside Katarzyna, was also of African origin. He belonged to a group of 12 African children purchased here in London in 1752 by Hieronym Florian Radziwiłł, brother of Rybenka, for theatrical training at the Radziwiłł court. Most of these children did not succeed, but few did, and Wojciech performed for several years in this ballet troupe. However, despite his talents, he later ended up in the service of Teofila as an attendant. Interestingly, in this context, he is not described in racial terms in this text, just Wojciech. So if you don't know the context, you just have no idea who is this guy with Polish name. This reflects the fact that the racial categorization was not always consistent or central in this region, and the blackness was visible, like some feature of complexion, but was not always formally defined. So on this small estate near Lida, we find at least 2 Africans serving a noble woman. Katarzyna likely spent much of her life there, but she always seemed to have traveled with her mistresses within aristocratic social networks, especially to assemblies to nearby Vilnius. So in 1779, Teofila wrote a letter to her brother, Karl Stanisław Radziwiłł Pań-Kochanku, inviting him to Vilnius for the carnival season. And it is pretty peculiar letter, so I will quote. So she writes, at the masquerade, there was a most peculiar skirmish. 2 young ladies, Horodenska and Krajewska, both beauties, came to blows, slapping each other in the face over who should have first place in the dance. And the quarrel is still going on. Who knows, perhaps it may come to a duel. But upon my word, they are pretty. Your princely grace could surely reconcile them with that weapon of yours you carry beneath your belt. Do take pity and come to Vilnius for next 4 Sundays. There would be young ladies enough, and might even be found for Secretary Bernatovich, at least my Mures Kasia. This remark about Kasia Katarzyna can be read in different ways. On the one hand, it may reflect racist irony in the modern sentiment. Teofila compares beautiful young noble women to a dark-skinned, aged woman of about 50 who evidently did not conform to the ideals of youth and beauty of the society. However, it may also be a much grimmer hint, pointing to the sexual exploitation that often targeted vulnerable servant maids, and perhaps especially someone as exoticized and unprotected as Katarzyna was. Despite the sexualization of the black body was a noticeable trend in European cultural and general discourse of the time, like this painting from Saxon Palace in Warsaw. This is especially invisible in sources and in Belarusian sources, but not necessarily absent. The most extensive and unique source about Katarzyna comes from 1800. Moreover, it is a rare opportunity to catch her own voice. It is her petition to the head of the Radziwiłł's domain, Michal Hieronym Radziwiłł, who was like a guardian of this property at the time. So in this, from this document, we learn that she was living already in Vilnius in a brick house, kamienica, which she held as a lifelong tenure. However, she lacked the financial means to maintain herself and the property, so she reminded Michal Hieronym Radziwiłł of an earlier promise to support her after these long years of service. This short text includes a lot of very small but very informative details, but I will highlight just a few. So how we can read against the grain and to find out some hidden hints. Pretty speculative, but it's the only way we can regain some information about them. First, Katarzyna appears here the only time with a surname, Rudnicka. This is quite unusual for some of her status. We do not know whether she acquired it through marriage, because no one mentioned about it, or whether this reflects the growing bureaucratic requirements of Russian administration that take over these lands. So everyone should have surname. However, it underlines that her subjectivity and her independent status. Another unusual detail that Katarzyna refers to herself using the Russian term Arabka, not Muzhinka. It may reflect her earlier identification in Russia, like in her early years, or maybe contemporary context with officials that Russian calls her Arabka. But also possible that the term Muzhin in this context functioned more as a kind of courtly service role, like Haiduk or Kozak, that not necessarily were Hungarian or Ukrainians. So by calling herself Arabka, she may set a distance to her former servant status, because now she was like a retired one and a more autonomous one. She also refers to herself as sirota, orphan. This seems to be a very meaningful self-description. In the sources, I have not encountered Africans being explicitly labeled as nivolniцы or poddani or something like this, like slaves. So it looked like a kind of paternalistic dimension where such individuals could be treated as minor or dependent members of the household. It implied an expectation of lifelong gratitude and service without formal remuneration. Indeed, Africans very rarely appear in salary records. They did not accumulate wealth even after long service, unlike any other servants. Even in retirement, they remained dependent on the goodwill and material support of their former patrons. But in return, there seems to have been an expectation and even a claim to these patrons that they owed them protection and care in return. This, I think, offers an important clue to how their status and identity were shaped within these households, especially for those who entered as children, and many of them do this. And this petition was successful. Over the next years, records show that she received a pension until at least 1810. She likely died around 1810 at an advanced age, around 80 years old. So it's a success story, if you can call this. She was much luckier than many of other African servants who died sooner or later alone from the climate and disease without any possession and autonomy, leaving only a brief line in their master's record. And interestingly, you can see another name underlined here, Jean Lapierre, the official featuring in this pension receipt, was also a person of African, or more precisely Afro-Caribbean descent. So many Africans in one and in one time, and not only these two, by the way. So Jean Lapierre had served Tadeusz Kościuszko, later entered the service of the Radzivills as an attendant, and went on to make quite a remarkable career. He became a Marshalik, a chamberlain of the Radziwill household. In this role here, a member of Masonic Lodge, and eventually ended up as a landowner, like landlord. Lapierre represents, in a way, a different type of Black presence in the region. By the late 18th century, we can observe the emergence of a group of free African servants. They spoke several European languages, were skilled in their profession, and were able to move between different aristocratic households and even countries. So in this document, quite symbolically, we see a kind of meeting point between two groups of Africans at the margins of the Atlantic world, one deeply subordinated within this system of informal dependency from childhood, and the other navigating and to some extent reshaping the same system. So to conclude, the story of Katarzyna may suggest that the history of Belarus was more deeply entangled in global processes than it's usually assumed. Belarusian lands were deeply entangled in global systems of slavery and colonial exchange, and even without direct colonial involvement, local demand enabled the traffic of enslaved Africans. Katarzyna's life illustrates a strong asymmetrical dependency marked by erasure, control, isolation, lack of clear status, and at the same time, her case suggests limited agency or interagency and possibilities of adaptation with these constraints. And fragmentary sources still allow cautious reconstruction, as we say, if read critically and beyond established preconceptions and narratives. The relative invisibility of Africans in the history of Belarus seems to result not only from the scarcity of sources, but also from the limits of our historical perspective, from what we expect to see and what we are prepared to recognize as part of our history. Thank you.
Although thank you for keeping very long time. So now we move to the, well, if you have any questions, please keep them till the end to collect them after we hear all presentations. So now we move to the presentation by Jerzy Pervotselinniki, the theme of the Virgin Land in Kazakhstan project, gradually developing the system or a new form of colonization, the case of the Pervotselinniki from the Belarusian SSL.
Thank you very much for an invitation and opportunity to participate in this event. Dziękuję. Firstly, I would like to highlight I am not expert on Belarus and Belarusian history. My area of research is rather Kazakhstan and Central Asia. But I guess the topic is very interesting and very important also from Belarusian point of view. The great Khrushchev project, освоение Celiny, taming of the virgin lands. The question in the title is I mean, brotherly development assistance or a new form of colonialism is maybe more important from Kazakhstani point of view, not for Belarusian to this extent. I mean, I guess the most important from our point of view is the role of Belarusian Pervotselinniki in the whole process. In my paper, I mean full version, I try to analyze the mechanism of social mobilization for the освоение Celiny project in the Belarusian Soviet Republic and the reactions to it based on official documents from Belarusian and Kazakhstani archives. As for documents, the vast majority of documents, there are consular documents from the National Archive of the Republic of Belarus and to some extent from regional archives in Belarus and Kazakhstan. Of course, I had no access to National Archive of the Republic of Belarus and to Belarusian archives. I obtained copies of these documents from our Kazakhstani colleagues thanks to my activities in the Polish Kazakhstani Historian Commission. It is a selection of documents prepared to be published as a zbornik dokumentów, but it had never been published and it will never be published. I think, but of course, there are not classified KGB documents, but I think there are, and they are full of propaganda, of Soviet propaganda, but nevertheless, I think they are very interesting. But let's start with some general remarks. The territories of what would later become Soviet Belarus had already experienced peasant resettlements due to the scarcity of land. In Russian Tsarist terminology, mało ziemi, before the revolution and even before Stolypin's reforms. But let's focus on Khrushchev epoch. As a result of large-scale propaganda and agitation campaign carried out primarily by local Komsomol organization and cells between 1954 and 1964. Approximately 700,000 people left the Belarusian Soviet Republic, of which the vast majority went to Kazakhstan. A sizable portion, of course, later returned to Belarus. Initially, volunteers Pervotselinniki were overwhelmingly male. Women's recruitment began later and encountered some obstacles. To give some data, according to the 1959 census, 107,000 Belarusians lived in Kazakhstan. It was something about 1.2% of the total republic's population. And while the census in question already showed a significant return movement and migration to the cities of Pervotselinniki. According to the 1970 census, there were already almost 200,000 Belarusians in Kazakhstan, so it means 1.5% of the population. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this number decreased somewhat. At the beginning of the 21st century, there were more than 111,000 persons of Belarusian origin in Kazakhstan declaring themselves Belarusian, with the largest number in Kostanay, Karaganda, and Akmola regions. But let's turn to the 1950s. The mobilization of Komsomols was often accompanied by some kind of pioneering theory. But this campaign was full of internal contradictions. Volunteers were dispatched from Belarus according to the numerical plan for the year or provided for in a specific order, and the quotas were still divided among the various republics' regions. So we have volunteer basis versus planned economy, versus quotas. Of course, this places certain limits on the public enthusiasm of those willing to do. Decisions to remain in Kazakhstan on return to Belarus were certainly made based on many factors, including those of personal nature. Komsomol documents make rather general statements on this subject. It must be said, however, that many people driven by sincere enthusiasm were met with unpleasant disappointments. Young people on a mission arrive on the spot, but also a lot of random people, adventurers of all sorts, and released criminals, commonly referred to as muty, who were welcomed at the railway station by the terrified local children. I heard about it in Kazakhstan. Local Komsomol committees have often been accused of careless selection of volunteers. Objectively speaking, the Russian volunteers could feel like settled state by the metropole to its colony, encouraged by higher wages to contribute to the modernization of a backward and remote country. If one is guided by economic data, Belarusian Pervotselinniki can be considered representatives of more economically developed areas. For in the period from the 1960s to the late 1980s, the per capita production of consumer goods in the Kazakh Soviet Republic was nearly 2.4 times lower than that of Soviet Belarus. And surely some of the Belarusian Pervotselinniki felt this way in the new surroundings, perceiving the situation they found themselves in this way. But to give some general background on migration processes in Belarus, Kazakhstan was not the only migration destination in the Belarusian case. It should be borne in mind that emigration to the Skaryna in Kazakhstan was part of the general migration trends in Belarus during this period. It resulted from the fact that at the turn of the 1950s and 1960s, the Belarusian countryside was on the brink of crisis. From the second half of the 1950s, migration from rural areas to cities began to increase. This was because the growth in cash income in cities began to exceed the growth in agricultural production. The demand for labor was enormous at the time as the construction of large industrial plants began in cities. In 1950s, the percentage of urban and rural populations in Belarus was 21% and 79% respectively, and in 1959, 31% and 69% respectively. Kolkhoz workers accounted for 48% of the total population, which placed the Republic in third place in the Soviet Union in this respect, after Moldova and Tajikistan. The Belarusian Soviet Republic was also the leader in the Soviet Union in terms of intensity of external migration. What is very important in my opinion, according to data from the 1970 census, the Kazakh Soviet Republic was the only republic with a significant Belarusian population that could boast a unique paradigm. The majority of this group declared Belarusian, not Russian, as their primary language, which some researchers believed was due to the fact that most of them lived in rural areas rather than cities. Of course, urbanization significantly accelerated Russification, but I argue, however, that the newly established state farms of Sovkhozy have become a breeding ground for Belarusian culture and identity in Kazakhstan. For example, I remember one of the documents where young people from Sovkhoz in eastern Kazakhstan they asked Belarusian Academy of Sciences to send them books in Belarusian language, not in Russian. So it's good example of this phenomenon. Some comparisons to another nationalities, because of course these areas of northern Kazakhstan, so-called Celiny Krai, was a melting pot where Belarusian, Russian, and Ukrainian Pervotselinniki met deported Poles, Germans, Koreans, and titular nation. And unlike culturally self-sufficient German sovkhozy, which also became bastions of German culture on the Kazakh steppe and most likely had some influence on the Belarusian settlers, Belarusian sovkhozy, like Belarusian volunteers in general, were able to benefit from all union support as part of the cultural services, kulturne obsługiwanie, for Celliniki mandated by central authorities. It was the practice, for example, that individual branches of the Belarusian Komsomol and sport organization exercised patronage over a selected Belarusian sovkhozy in Kazakhstan. The existence of cultural infrastructure was probably also one of the factors that made people decide to stay in Kazakhstan, not to return. It seems that the cities of Kazakhstan didn't become a place where Belarusian national consciousness and culture could flourish. We should remember the fact that a huge number of people were sent to the Virgin Lands, which exceeded the real need for workers in the region. As a rule, they, having failed to realize themselves in rural areas, migrated to the cities, replenishing the population of virgin towns. Here, the increase in the growth of crime, for example, in the city Tselinograd, administrative center of the Tselin Krai, given high Russian urban shares, particularly in northern Kazakhstan, and non-Russian, including the Russian Pervotselinniki in a local urban environment, had generally a much greater chance to being classified than rural settlers in sovkhoz, primarily due to the fact that Russians were much more prevalent in the cities as a modernizing force than on the farms, not to mention the exclusively Belarusian sovkhozy. Meanwhile, in Tselinograd, Belarusians were largely doomed to become a Russian-speaking, denationalized lumpen proletariat. For there were among them many people who didn't find use for their abilities in their native region and whose labor was not in demand, as well as people who didn't want to work consensuously. As a rule, such people went to the Virgin Lands not to work consensuously and develop the Virgin Lands, but in search of easy profits. Among the settlers, there were many people with criminal backgrounds who had been released from prison shortly before. Some of them went to the Virgin Lands in search of a better life, while others, due to their circumstances, had no opportunity to return to their native lands and therefore left for Kazakhstan. A lot of urban population arrived to the Virgin Lands who had no skills and experience of work in agriculture, and a large number of Pervotselinniki had no secondary education. Economic dimension of the process. It should be remembered that along with the Pervotselinniki, cash also found its way into the Belarusian and Kazakh countryside, where a natural economy prevailed until then. For example, I interviewed Kazakhstani Poles deported, and they remember that until arrival of Pervotselinniki, they saw no cash, no money. It was everything within framework of natural Caucasus economy, trudodni, palochki, and so on, so on. The average monthly earnings of permanent workers on Virgin Lands were something between 500 and 800 rubles. The average monthly wage of agricultural workers in the mid-1950s was less than 500 rubles. For students, a trip to Kazakhstan often means earning their first money, although it still happened that they were paid still in the trudodni system. People also send the money they earned there to their families, and it's a question of impact of this money transfers. But equally important, that thanks to the Pervotselinniki, cash also appeared for the first time among the deported nationalities who were still living under a special comment regime until 1956. This wave of migration from Belarus also led to a certain degree of liberalization of movement. The rural Pervotselinniki travel long distances under the so-called Komsomol Putyovka without an internal passport, the only document being a travel permit, komandirowoczne udostawlenie. And to conclude, but some conclusions are open questions for me. Although in Soviet official rhetoric, the trip to Kazakhstan took on the character of brotherly development assistance, in reality, it was more like settlers from the metropole going to the colonies in hopes of quick profits. Post-war destruction in Belarus may also have played a role determining which regions people were more willing to leave to seek their fortune far from home. Nevertheless, many volunteers may have felt a sense of mission and been guided by pioneering ethos, and their arrival may have been accompanied by certain benefits of colonization. However, there were internal contradictions in the whole mobilization process, as a number of volunteers were determined from above. This means that, contrary to appearances, the line between these voluntary departures and deportations, for example, of Poles and Germans from Soviet Ukraine in 1936, is not so clear-cut. Deportation was compulsory, but those deported were also enticed with the pioneering ethos. The Pervotselinniki became heralds of monetary economy, replacing the natural economy. In Kazakhstan, this led to a certain erosion of the Gulag economy, while the question of how remittances affected the society of Soviet Belarus remains open. The impact of the departure of many young, energetic people on Soviet Belarusian society also remains an open question. Did those who returned become a catalyst for change? Did those who remained in Kazakhstan deprive Belarusian society of potential leaders, activists, and critical thinkers? Or was the potential energy of the frustrated and disappointment channeled into hooliganism mentioned in Komsomol documents? There are no mentions of conflict between the Pervotselinniki and the native Kazakh population, although their attitude towards locals could sometimes be paternalistic. However, a peculiar Soviet patriotism among the newcoming volunteers made itself felt, taking aggressive and hooliganistic forms toward, for example, the traitors of fatherland, like deported Chechens, for example. To conclude, the vast Skaryna epic, Skaryna epopeia in Russian was based on a life from the very beginning. The Pervotselinniki of the 1950s and 1960s were in fact not true pioneers, meaning they were not actually true Pervotselinniki.
Great. Thank you very much. Again, if your questions, so after we hear our third presentation by Zhyhal between science and politics, Tamaš and the written agenda in Interwar Czechoslovak sociology is in line, right? So the floor is yours. We are listening.
Okay. Hello. Hello, everyone. Can you see me?
Yeah.
And my presentation, I hope.
Yeah, we can see it.
Cool. Well, first of all, I want to say, just because it's important, I'm used meeting people at various conferences and they mispronouncing my name, and I'm glad that that tradition continues and even twice. Thank you. And as time is limited and I have a great deal to cover, I shall get directly to my presentation, but I will begin it with a small digression. In Victor Walter's novel, written in the end of 1920s, there is a scene in which Belarusian students in Prague celebrate the birthday of one of their friends and the fact that he is about to receive his engineering degree. And during this gathering, one of the central characters, Uncle Tomaszewicz, delivers an emotional speech. He begins with describing Belarus as a cold and wintry land, then turns to Prague, which he presents as only a temporary stop on the way home, back to a peasant Belarus struggling for national survival. And according to him, every Belarusian student who earns a diploma becomes a swallow of spring who will bring culture and enlightenment back to the Belarusian people. Although this scene may appear overly theatrical for a student party in a working class district of Prague, it closely echoed the rhetoric of a real historical figure behind this character, Tamaš Hryb, whom Walter had known personally during his years in Prague and transformed him into the novel's character. In my opinion, this fictional episode captures the broader vision that shaped Hryb's intellectual and political activity, the belief that the Belarusian intellectuals would become the key agent of national transformation. But my argument for today that for Hryb, sociology was not simply an academic discipline, but a practical instrument of national building after the failure of the Belarusian People's Republic. I cannot dwell on Hryb's biography in detail, but a few points are important. Born into a poor peasant family, he became involved in the Belarusian national movement while studying in St. Petersburg, and later participated in the Belarusian attempts to establish the Belarusian state. After rejecting cooperation with Bolsheviks, he went into exile in Prague, where he studied sociology at Charles University and obtained in 1927 a doctorate in sociology. Hryb's biography is important here, not simply as an individual story, but because it reveals a broader relationship between sociology, nationalism, and project of national revival in interwar Central Europe. What matters, therefore, it's not simply that Hryb studied sociology in Prague, but what kind of sociology he encountered there. And at this point, two questions become particularly important, even if I can answer them only speculatively. First, why was Hryb allowed to study at the Faculty of Philosophy at all? Second, why did he choose sociology as his field of specialization? Hryb studied in Prague on a scholarship provided by the Czechoslovak government and administered through representatives of the Belarusian People's Republic in exile. Normally, Belarusian students were expected to study practical disciplines that could directly benefit the future nation, like agriculture, engineering, medicine, and so on. In this context, Hryb's enrollment at the Faculty of Philosophy appears somewhat unusual and was probably made possible by his authority amidst emigre Belarusian circles. His choice of sociology is equally revealing. In the 1920s, sociology was still an unstable and contested discipline whose methods, subject matter, and academic status remained uncertain. But Hryb deliberately chose it as a field of specialization. And in my opinion, this decision becomes more understandable if we consider the specific character of Czech sociology. From the very emergence of the discipline in the Czech lands during the 1880s, sociology was expected to play a crucial political role and contribute directly to the national issue. The founder of Czech sociology, Tomáš Masaryk, developed an approach he described as critical realism, which combined the ideal of impartial scientific analysis with a strong commitment to social reformism and democratic humanism. At the same time, Masaryk's sociology retained important elements of religious philosophy of history, grounded on the belief that historical development ultimately favored nations committed to democratic and humanitarian ideals. As a result, Czech sociology dominated until the 1930s by Masaryk's students, collaborators, and intellectual successors, developed not simply as a neutral social science, but as a politically ambitious form of historical and social thought, articulated through the language of positivist scientism. And for a Belarusian emigre politician whose political project had collapsed, this intellectual tradition offered an alternative way of continuing the national struggle through scholarship, culture, and scientific study of society. And if we look at the reviews of Hryb dissertation, we can see that the reviewers recognize both the ambitions and the limitations of his sociological project. The reviewers agreed that the problem of nation and nationality was an important and difficult subject, but they also stressed the preliminary character of the work. Franciszek Krejci describes the dissertation as a thoughtful and critical treatment of the topic despite certain gaps in the literature used by the author. And the second reviewer was more cautious, arguing that such a complex sociological problem required much broader empirical and historical research than Hryb was yet able to provide. And at the same time, both reviewers acknowledged that Hryb had engaged seriously with several fundamental questions concerning nationalhood and nationality, and the dissertation was ultimately accepted for defense in November 1927. This episode is significant because it reveals the ambiguous status of Hryb's work, situated somewhere between academic sociology, political thought, and national activism. Hryb dissertation is important also because it reveals how he understood sociology and its social function. His thinking combined the influence of Masaryk and Czech sociology with elements of Leopold von Wiese formal sociology. For Hryb, sociology was an independent science of social relations and interactions. Social life, in his understanding, emerged through interactions between individuals, And these interactions gradually produced larger social formations, crowds, communities, nations, and states. At the same time, Hryb inherited from Masaryk the conviction that knowledge must serve practical purposes. Sociology, therefore, had to address concrete political and national questions. What determines the national character? What makes one nation different from another? What are conditions for the existence of nation? What is the relationship between nationality and the state, between nationality and internationalism? And these questions were not abstract, theoretical problems for Hryb. They were directly connected to the future of the Belarusian national projects. And Hryb developed many of these ideas while working at the Ukrainian Sociological Institute, founded in Prague in 1924 by the Ukrainian politician and sociologist Mikita Shapoval. Like Hryb, Shapoval emerged from the socialist revolutionary tradition and arrived in Prague after the defeat of the Ukrainian Revolution, having immigrated to Czechoslovakia in 1920. He increasingly turned to sociology as a way of continuing political struggle by cultural and intellectual means. And the intellectual and political parallels between Shapoval and Hryb are very striking. Both were influenced by Masaryk and formal sociology, and both believed that sociology should serve the practical needs for national movements. For Shapoval, the Czech national revival provided a model for Ukraine. In turn, the Belarusian case could be understood as a part of the same broader Eastern European pattern of national awakening, and he just proposed that Belarus should follow the Ukraine and Ukraine should follow the Czechoslovakia. Working at the Ukrainian Sociological Institute, Mikita Shapoval, organizing the Ukrainian Sociological Institute, Mikita Shapoval invited Hryb to establish a Belarusian cabinet devoted to study of Belarusian society and culture, and he did it. The cabinet was established at the end of 1927, and Hryb served as its academic secretary, recruiting Belarusian researchers in Czechoslovakia to take part in its work. The cabinet was intended to become, over time, an independent research institute. According to Hryb, its main task was to collect and organize materials on the history, geography, literature, art, and economy of Belarus, and also on the history of the Belarusian national movements. The project was financed by the Czechoslovak Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also received additional support from the Ukrainian Sociological Institute. However, when the Czechoslovak government stopped funding the institute in 1930, the Belarusian cabinet also had to close because of financial difficulties. Despite its short existence, the cabinet laid important foundations for Belarusian studies. It began building a specialized Belarusian library, whose collection later became the basis of the Belarusian section of the Slavonic library in Prague. And interestingly, some documents of the period refer to Belarus not simply as Belarus, but as Krivichina. So this term from Lastovsky, just to construct a more deeper historical basis for Belarusian national identity. And arguing that the problem of nation was fundamentally a problem of organization, Hryb insists that the nation and the state are inseparable concepts. Just as one cannot imagine the thing without its external form, one cannot imagine a nation without its state. Every nation must be a state, and every state must be national. For Hryb, the existence of an independent Belarusian state was therefore an unquestionable political and moral value. And it's even funny that in his dissertation, at some point, just in the middle of the text, in the middle of nowhere, he just writing, "I'm a Belarusian, I must fulfill my moral duty." And as a conclusion, I would like to say that Hryb's intellectual trajectory was not unique. Across interwar Central and Southeastern Europe, sociology often developed in close connection with projects of national consolidation, cultural emancipation, and state building. Newly established or still stateless nation sought not only political independence, but also scientific and cultural frameworks capable to legitimize national existence within this broader European modern order. And similar tendencies could be observed elsewhere in these regions. In Romania, for example, Dimitrie Gusti developed his large-scale project of peasant sociology as a part of a broader effort to study and reinforce Romanian national society. And in Yugoslavia, Vladimir Dvorniković attempted to define the psychological and cultural character of the Yugoslav people in his famous work, Characterology of the Yugoslavs. And in my opinion, Hryb's work belonged to this wider regional context in which sociological knowledge was expected to serve national and political purposes. Therefore, Hryb's case demonstrates a broader regional phenomenon. In interwar Central and Southeastern Europe, sociology could function not merely as a science of society, but as a political and cultural instrument for nations whose statehood remained fragile, incomplete, or entirely absent. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And my apologies for mispronouncing your name. It would be easy if you were in the room. I could ask you in the break. Okay, so questions. Do we have I don't know, is it a tradition that I start with my questions? Is it a privilege?
Yeah, you can, please.
It's kind of, I feel uncertain. Is it possible? Okay, because first of all, thank you again for 3 wonderful presentations. Each are very different, but also quite fascinating stories. So yeah, since I am allowed to do it, I'll start with my questions. My questions to Vital. I was wondering to what extent this, first of all, whether you know how widespread this habit was to have someone in the household, like servants, which were not white. And to what extent, because we are talking about aristocracy, right? To what extent it was the idea of modeling on the Western European kind of idea of high society, right? How it should be in a civilized so-called world, and trying to kind of model their own household, even though obviously there were no direct connections. This like very with Britain, etc. And whether because I didn't really get how prevalent and how pronounced was this whole idea of racial superiority, inferiority, because it did feel like it's more just a difference, and it didn't really feel like it played an important role in how the hierarchies within the household. I don't know. Should I ask 3 questions, right?
Otherwise we'll have no time.
Yeah. Okay. So very quickly about the Pervotselinniki. I was just wondering about the numbers. You mentioned like how many Belarusians in Kazakhstan at that point, but obviously you can't really count how many of them, for example, were sent, were deported as well, right? Because I remember I did a bit of research on Kazakhstan, and sometimes you talk to people and they say, well, my family was sent during Stolypin reform, right? Someone was there since Tsarist Russia, someone there because of Stalinist repression. So there are multiple ways of arrivals or arrival of people. So I wonder this number which you gave, like 100,000, 200,000, which of them would be accounted like for actually Pervotselinniki and which were actually probably there before. Or not to mention, obviously, also during the Second World War, people were just moved because of the Nazi occupation. And my question to Ivan, I was just wondering, because you were referenced multiple times to Czechoslovakian nation, but we obviously know that it wasn't kind of the idea of Czechoslovakian nation moved forward by a state. But there was also Slovak nationalism, which was not, well, there was a little bit more complex than that, right? And which ultimately ended with dissolution of state. So I wonder whether there was any sensitivities among Ukrainians or Belarusians to what this Czechoslovakian nationalism also is a little bit problematic for some, as part of the society. Yeah. So question, and then we'll open for.
Get the mic.
Yeah. So.
So about the scale of this African presence and its relation to this racial superiority, as far as I get the question. First of all, these household Africans were not the only, they are the most visible ones. Because I encounter many people that are supposedly African, but we are not sure, but they are in other roles. They are not always considered Africans, like Moors, Mujins. But those in households, they were directly denoted like this, and it was their like role in the household. Even there were sometimes like local Belarusian guys, black-faced, who should play this role of black servant in some cases. In other situations, during the masquerades, royal and aristocratic persons could blackface and play like a king or queen of Moors. It's rather to the question of the status. And what about scale? I mostly concentrate now in my current project on the household of the Radzivills. And in my database, it's like around 30 Africans connected to the Radzivills. Is it a lot or not? We can speculate, but also interestingly, that the presence of Africans in the culture even more widespread than their presence in the physical one. What about, but again, this scale is very difficult to count because like we consider that African is so unusual, so it should be recorded everywhere. But no, even in the like this book of Hieronym Florian Radziwiłł, who boasted how he can entertain his guests, he never mentioned Africans, despite he had a group of Africans. So Africans was just some kind of servants, like Cossacks, like Haiduks, like Kalmyks, but not something extraordinary, very extraordinary. That's why sometimes you can see only one short reference or you can never be sure if it is just a black-faced person playing this role or is it a real person. So indeed, it is difficult to evaluate, but numbers, but their role and their presence, I think, was much more important or meaningful for their masters than their small numbers, if to briefly address. And about this superiority question, indeed, in this early modern period, we can trace how this superiority arises. In the Middle Ages and in the beginning of the early modern time, Moors, it is something Muslim with dark skin, not necessarily from Africa, maybe from India, maybe from Arabia. And this Orient is mysterious, it is superior. It is a place of wealth, of wisdom, of some secret magic, knowledge, and so on. And we can see images of Africans like this wise man coming to Christ, or Queen of Sheba with Solomon, and so on. So in the beginning of the period, it is we can't say about inferiority, maybe about monstrosity, like black, like devil's black because of hellfire. But in the 18th century, we see totally different. Probably Africans was the first bright case of racialization and building hierarchy. I won't speak about general trend in European discourse, but even in our lands, we can see that Moors appear only in one category. It is servants. And even in this case, we see African try to distance from this. If it is locally born African or people mixed race, like General Franciszek Władysław Jabłonowski, who had nickname Murzynek, but no one considered him Murzyn, African, despite he fought later against Haitian rebels in the ranks of French army. So it was rather a situational moment, and it was related to social status. But of course, when you see blacks only as servants, or hear stories about them as savages, you will have these stereotypes. And only in 19th century, with development of racial discourse, it became set in stone. So for us, it is very natural to consider that there are races as certain objection, and this racism of stereotyping some groups of people like inferior, but it was not the case. It's pretty historical developed.
Hold it in your hand.
Okay, I have also small comment to colleague on Murzynka, Katarzyna Murzynka, but let's start from I am not able to give you precise figures. Of course, I agree. There was migration from Belarusian territories in the Stolypin era and the pre-revolutionary period. Of course, we can give data on migration and resettlement scale, but it's a question and tricky issue who would declare themselves as Belarusians. There were also 4 mass deportations of Polish citizens by Soviet authorities. Among them, there were Belarusians, and they were denied right to return to communist Poland. Only Poles and Jews could return. So it's also a question of identity. Also, in the case of Kazakhstan Poles, I think that it's very important to underline that it was, for example, in the case of Poles, it was question of choice, because when I interviewed Poles in Kazakhstan, I was told that after liberalization in 1926, almost all parents said children zapishi z ruskim, so choose Russian nationality because it is easier to live in Soviet Union. Polish identity in Soviet Union was to much extent tabooist because due to so-called Polish operation of NKVD, genocidal activity of Soviet authorities. In the case of Belarusians, I think is to some extent a different issue, but it's also a question who declare in official sense Belarusian identity and who not. So it's too concrete. It's very difficult to give precise numbers. But I think that the vast majority of people who declare themselves in Kazakhstan as Belarusians are descendants of Pervotselinniki. My small comment on Katarzyna Murzynka. To be honest, I don't know precise etymology and semantic evolution of Murzynka. Maybe it comes from Maur, but Katarzyna Murzynka, you translated it as Katarzyna Catherine de Mures. Murzyn now is out of use due to political correctness because it is something between black person and the nigger. And for example, there was famous poem by interwar period poet Julian Tuwim, Murzynek Bambo, czarną skórę ma nasz ten koleżka, so our friend has the black skin. And now it's Julian Tuwim is by some regarded as racist, but it's anachronism. So because the very term Murzyn is old-fashioned, also we have word Maur, and it is also old-fashioned due to Iberian influences. It sometimes covered all Muslims, like Turkey and Turkey Maure, it was Muslims. But the word Murzyn has no religious connotation. So because Maur means Muslim, Murzyn doesn't mean Muslim. But I am not a specialist on Polish philology, so maybe you know better about evolution of the term Murzyn.
I think maybe we'll return the questions and then we'll continue because time is tight. Well, maybe Ivan briefly answer.
Yep. Okay. Nelly, thank you for your question. And I can say that there was something of a consensus regarding the existence of Czechoslovak nation, even if it was a highly artificial construct. And this was a very sensitive topic. So sociologists, Czechoslovakian sociologists tried to avoid it for the sake of the state stability as such. And moreover, in case of interwar Czechoslovakia, it's better to speak not of a Czechoslovak nation, but of the ideology of Czechoslovakism, like a project of putting together separate Czech and Slovak nation to create some kind of entity. Anyway, for their part, Ukrainian sociologist and Tamaš Hryb did not raise this issue because it was just unsafe to do so.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I guess it's time to open the floor for questions. Yeah, thank you so much. And really continue.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for your beautiful, very interesting presentation. My name is Lisa. I'm from Harvard University.
We'll use that mic. Yep. That one.
Okay. Thank you so much again. I have questions for Vitaly and Ivan. My question to Vitaly is regarding the Enlightenment project and the racial discourse about that, because you showed very consistently that these mentions were shown throughout the second half of the 18th century and earlier 19th century. And this is very interesting because it was the decades where the Enlightenment project took place, and it was critiqued by many Black studies theorists that it was exactly the Enlightenment project that not only defined what is the human, but that also defined what people should not be counted as humans. So it is interesting to see this transformation of the definition and the transformation of social status among Black people regarding the evolution of Enlightenment project. And also, it is interesting to take into the account that, for example, when we are depicting servants, they could not be monstrous. Like, on the other hand, they should be someone that we could rely on, someone that could listen to us if we imagine ourselves as, I don't know, like pastors in our house. And for example, in the picture of Augustus III, the King of Poland, there is a Black servant boy that is taking his helmet, and he, on the contrary, looks very fragile and young, whereas the King of Poland looks very masculine, tall, and in the like metallic cloth. And my another question is to the Ivan. I was very intrigued by the mentioning of the work on the free will from the sociological standpoint, because if we can emerge to the sociology in the beginning of 20th century, basically the question of the free will was no, there is no free will, right? Because we have our decisions and our actions are framed by our sociological background, upbringing, and especially in Marxist sociology, this was specifically clear. So I'm wondering what were the view of Tamaš regarding this topic. It's very interesting. Thank you so much.
I suggest we pull up some questions. If you have any. Yeah, please. Yeah, yes.
Hello, my name is Ina, based Krakow, Poland, and my question to Dr. Jerzy Rohoziński. Well, I have an anecdotal evidence of my sister or my grandmother who was actually lured to go to Kazakhstan to upbring Tselina. But actually, my question is another one. Actually, after the certain period of time, Kazakhstan actually, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan started to implement the policy of nationalism, and they started to clean all those people of Belarusian origin from bodies, state bodies, ministries, police, well, in general, governmental bodies. And actually, then there was an exodus actually of people from Belarus back to Belarus or to other positions. So they were just forced out from the governmental bodies. So that my question is, did you probably have a chance to study what was actually the consequences of the second generation of those people, not only Belarusian, I believe, the Ukraine or even Russian, that they were actually, well, the first generation of these people were upbringing the Kazakhstan, but the second generation had to leave it because of that policy of nationalism. Actually, well, my uncle had to leave his ministerial position in the foreign department and had to get back to Belarus after 45 years of living in Kazakhstan because it was impossible to proceed with his work and living. Okay, thank you.
We've got a question here.
Because it's closed and I go next.
Hi, my name is Veronica Laputska, Polish Academy of Sciences. I'm a big fan of general research of Vital, whatever you do. And my question is just a very quick one. How did you come up with this idea to specifically look into this subject? I know you always have very creative ways how you do it. Please share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is for Jerzy. Actually, my father was born in Kazakhstan because his mother, my grandmother, moved to Kazakhstan from Baranovichi before even she turned, I think it was 16. because that was the minimum age. She forged her document because she badly wanted to go to Kazakhstan. But my question is really how, well, and I will show you her memoirs where she writes in detail how they moved there, how there was a big train from Brest going all the way to Kazakhstan, how they were there were 30 girls and 200 boys, something like that. Anyway, but my question is, what was the attitude of the local population to these people? Were they seen more like colonizers, like foreigners coming and invading us, imposing their rules, or people were more thankful, saying, "Okay, you're creating all this infrastructure. Yeah, please help, please stay us." Have you seen anything about that?
Okay, we'll get one more. Yeah,
One more, or two.
One more.
Okay.
If you have two, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to address one general question to Ivan and his opinion on this, one of the latest remarks in his work, that sociology at the time when Hryb wrote his work was sort of used for political means. So don't you think that it is not what happened only back then, but something that is always happening in science? It is never separated from politics, sociology and any other discipline too. And for Vital, I wondered this conversion of these people into different faiths and change of the name, was it all pretty much the requirement of slavery? Like their masters decided if you move from one to another, you have to convert into whatever, Catholicism, or was there any agency of them, if it is possible to track at all, in choosing what kind of faith or name they want to have, if, for example, they wanted to fit in the society?
Okay, now we move to answers. Anyone wants to start? I guess you can start.
Well, try to remember all the questions. So probably logically to start from how I came to this topic. Actually, I spent all my life studying history of my native town, Zhyhal. I worked in the Museum of Radzivills, but only recently, a few years ago, to my surprise, I discovered that there were Africans, a lot of them, for pretty constant presence around centuries. And probably one of these Africans also paid to one of my great-grandfathers who were bought as serfs by the Radzivills themselves. It wasn't something really buried deep in archives. It was all the time on surface in scholarship. But it is so unfitting to our vision of our past, of history. So it just like mentioned like some curiosity and have no place to be included. So that was my start of digging deep in this rabbit hole to generally the very idea of this unbelonging of these groups to Belarusian, Polish, Lithuanian history, and this forgotten involvement of Belarusians in global processes, in the slave trade, in the colonization, even this Virgin Land campaign never framed as colonization in Belarus. So it was something mind-blowing for me. So I started and was lucky to start researching professionally. And I see that it is a topic really relevant for Belarusians and for people from Eastern Europe now. That something not only unusual, but some this burning question became more and more important for the general public as well. So, and very interesting questions about enlightenment. That's exactly the question I'm trying to figure out, because indeed enlightenment was this point when modern racism was invented and give a start to all this. It was exactly in the 18th century mostly, and I try to track now, was there this direct influence on Poland, Lithuania, on Belarus? Indeed, it was. You can see this textual influence, but a bit later, around 100 in the Vilnius University, it was a group of scholars that began to reflect on race. They even don't use this word race, like tribal, like premier, but I think in these terms. But earlier in 18th century, when these real Africans were presented, I still struggling to find this indirect influence, because direct influence, it was not so. It more was a part of Baroque culture, of this pre-Enlightenment approach, this Catholic approach that all humans have souls, they should be baptized, but there are still differences, and this religion is more important, and so on. But I'm still not sure. I'm still on track thinking for this question. So next one is about monstrosity, I guess. Indeed, also in sources from Belarusian lands, we can see a very distinct pattern of reactions. When people first saw African, they are scared. It is like seeing a devil, seeing like a monster, or something like this. But if they're familiar with African, they are amazed of beauty, and they describe it as something beautiful, and so on. So indeed, probably even for people of the time, it was more natural to meet a devil than African in Belarus. So, and like devils were indeed depicted in plays, on icons, as something dark-skinned. But no confusion, real confusion between real Africans and real devils. It just they look the same. And about depiction of African attendants on portraits, indeed, it's a rare occasion we can see these Africans, but we are not sure if they are real persons, because it was more like allegory figure. Baroque art put different allegories, and the African was also, if it is placed with a female aristocrat, it is this trope of slave of love. Like someone who, usually this slave has a earring, so it's a manumitted slave, but who stayed with the master because of love. And it was like this symbol, usually of married woman, that the husband is so in love like this slave. Sometimes, as I tracked this portrait of some Radzivills with this slave, I'm not sure if these people are really real persons or just copied from other portraits. And with males, it's also another meaning. African was a symbol of this ultimate slave. And for example, for female also, whom can women dominate? Only children, and in this case, African. And children, African is like ideal person to underline your beauty, fairness, and your power. The same with men. You correctly put that this servant, usually also like adolescent persons, very thin, and this huge, like white guy, white, beautiful, and full of power. And this slave is also like a context for this powerful person. So indeed, it was not a real person, but was symbols. Yeah.
Still answer the last question, I think. Not right, but
yeah. And the last one about erasure of identities. Yes, these identities were erased by slaves, slave masters, to put this person in the new context of this fantastic imagination about what it should symbolize. I have no references. It was voluntarily or exactly voluntarily, and if it is written by master, you can't trust if it is even in the source. So I doubt if it was really voluntarily.
not be more than 5 minutes.
Okay, so thank you, S, for question from you. Of course, my impression is that generally, but I have conducted research, first of all, among Polish repatriants from Kazakhstan. There is feeling of glass ceiling. Yeah, so you have no opportunities to go higher. Of course, Kazakhstan conduct policy promoting Kazakh nationality. First of all, it is attracting of so-called oral money, the Kazakh migrants from China, Xinjiang, Uyghur, Mongolia, and so on. They are not Russian speaking. They have different tradition than Sovietized Kazakhstanis from Sovietized Kazakhs from Kazakhstan. And as far as I saw, they are promoting to higher positions in administration even in northern Kazakhstan when there is a lot of Slavic population. But of course, it's a different question, but I have to say that to some extent, I understand the Kazakhstan policy on that issue because after the disastrous collectivization in 1930s and disastrous famine, Kazakhs faced biological extermination, and they are anxious to how to say nivellate percentage of Kazakh population in Kazakhstani society. But of course, it's not easy and not pleasant for Poles and for Belarusians and for other non-Kazakh nationalities in Kazakhstan. As for attitude of Kazakhs towards Pervotselinniki, generally, interethnic relations in Kazakhstan is to some extent taboo topic. It's very difficult to find truth because it's almost everything under propagandistic umbrella of friendship of nations and so on, so on. I think that attitude was different and depends on attitude of Pervotselinniki towards native population. Generally, my impression is that basic, how to say, front line in Kazakhstan was between Chechens and between other nationalities. Chechens, their how to say, their attitude was almost totally how to say, they generally didn't want to adapt. So I heard some stories when all nationalities in one place, Kazakhs, Poles, Russians, and so on, are united against Chechens. But I think that it depends on place and percentage of population. For example, in northern Kazakhstan, I heard from Poles that there were no Kazakhs around them, and the children asked fathers, "Father, why we live in Kazakhstan and there are only Poles and Germans in our village?" So it depends on place, I think.
Thank you very much, Ivan.
Yep, I'm here. Okay, for the first question, I shall respond by starting with a small anecdote. In an article on the history of Czechoslovak sociology, I came across a passage in which the author asks himself what remains after interwar Czechoslovak sociology, and the answer was nothing or almost nothing. Czechoslovak sociology was so out of step with its time that it's difficult to take it seriously. It was not sociology as we understand it today, and even then, the field was dominated by Masaryk and his ideas for spirituality and fine words about humanism. So the younger generation who wanted to study something contemporary and more relevant, such as Weber or Durkheim, had to go abroad. And it's funny fact, there was even an epistemological war in Czechoslovakia in the early 1930s when a younger generation of sociologists raised the question that instead of moral philosophy or social philosophy pretending to be a sociology, it was time to engage in real sociology. Yep. And for the second question, I'm a bit confused because it's a very philosophical question. We may understand everything in political terms, or we may not. Personally, I want to leave room for the separation of knowledge and see it not only as a field for political engagement, but a relatively autonomous field from which, of course, we can take something to transfer into the political sphere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So on this, well, I suggest we applaud again our panelists and